We're in the process of building a competitive stage rally car out of my 944 that was a former winter beater. We've gone through the whole chassis, kind of went over the whole cage building process. We went over all the fabrication of, the turbo manifold and the turbo system for this car, as well as the swap for this Volkswagen engine into this 944. On this episode, we're gonna go over the teardown and reassembly of this 07K Volkswagen 2.5 cylinder. So we're gonna start tearing down the engine because it has to go to the machine shop for the new pistons and rods that we got from Integrated Engineering. I'm gonna kind of do some exploratory look-sees inside this motor. I haven't really looked at it. It was just a junkyard dropout. I know the cams have some weird rust pitting. I'm gonna see if the lifters are still good. We're gonna have to dig through a bunch of different things, but yeah, just gonna start tearing it down so at least the bottom end can go to the machine shop, and then we'll figure out what to do with the valve train. Really shouldn't be doing it with an impact, because this is actually holds the cams, exhaust. See, this is the lobe damage. All these little pits. And see, this roller's also, well, it's a little dirt. So my next thing is how smooth do they all feel? That feels nice. Feels a little less nice. This looks like rust, but it's actually just oiled varnish, because it wipes off pretty easy. If these lobes rusted a little bit, the bearings in this were likely in the same scenario, and also the lifters. So the lifters, have to move freely, and if they got any moisture in there and then rusted in one spot, they're likely junk. Kind of gross in there. So, most tensioners, when you buy them, come compressed with a little pin in them, like that, and that holds the whole thing from expanding. But if you have any TIG wire or a little drill bit or something, and you're trying to reuse the same tensioner, you can just use whatever. Some minor struggling. Chain looks good. There it goes. Inside of engine. Feels kind of yucky. Okay, that's a good sign. Ooh, it's clean. Okay. This is the bottom half of the lower rod bearing, and this is the bearing itself in here. So this is the bearing shell itself. So they change color as the way through. There's a coating on them, and then they usually turn copper as they wear. So you can tell it's really nice. There's no scoring or anything. It's just a couple little shiny spots, which is completely normal. So that's really good. Also, I'm learning these are a split fracture rod. So you can see it's not a machined surface here. It's just random textures. So these are cast as one piece, and then they break them so that each cap only fits that rod. There's no tangs on this shell. I don't really care for that. But there's no, see, there's the tension. There's, the bearing is just like a whisker bigger, just the way it clips in, so that they hold themselves in. That's the tension. If something were knocking or had too much bearing clearance and was able to rattle around in there, it'll beat up the bearing and deform it so that it won't stay in the shell. So you'll see it where they stick to here. Sometimes it's just the stiction to the oil where they'll stick to the crank and then the bearing will come out of the shell. But that can also mean it took a hit at some point, whether it was excessive detonation or something that deformed the shell just enough where it lost its tension. So it's a good clue to see how healthy something is when you're taking it apart. So I put this guy back together the wrong way. But you can tell because it doesn't fit because it's a split fracture rod. And you can see how that edge is all just jagged. Pretty neat. These are the main caps, which hold the crankshaft spinning in its nice orientation here. So you always want to, they matter in their order, so you always want to make sure you number them or they are numbered. Volkswagen did a great little job here of numbering them 1 through 6, so I don't have to worry about it. This is the main cap. Bearings, these have tangs, that makes sense. So there's a little locating tab here. And that goes up against the other side of the block so that the bearing shell itself can't spin in its housing here. One thing I like to do putting together a lot of engines is like, you kind of land it in there, see, well, before you take it apart even, feel the effort. Like especially if it's in good shape, just feel how difficult that is to do. Kind of gives you a good idea that all engines should rotate pretty easily. But then when you're putting stuff together, once you torque all of the main caps and everything like that, spin it to make sure everything feels nice. Because if it's a little too much drag or something, you can tell then and find what bearing's doing bad stuff. So whether your clearances are off, which I had that happen with the LS I was putting together, I'd go to the last torque stage. There's 3 torque stages on that block. First 2 would fine, it was spin, nice and smooth. You go to the last one, thing would lock up and be really difficult to move. And it was one of the bearing shells was damaged. That was brand new, and it wasn't torquing down correctly. So that was what was stopping the crank. If you're not paying attention, you could have put that together and the thing would have immediately blown up. So usually give it a little spin to give the oil suction something to break, then crankshaft it. So these are those thrust bearings. So you see the little shiny spots from where it was touching the crank, which is fine. It didn't get into the next bearing material, and it's not a full touch all the way around, it's just a couple little spots. Same with this guy. A little more touching, but that's from the back. So that's the way a torque converter or a clutch would preload it when you push the crank that way. So that is a bare block. So this is a press-in plug for the end of the oil galley here. I'll let the machine shop take those out if they want to. Because if you're machining stuff, you're making a bunch of metal debris and you have to clean everything super thoroughly to get it all out. Because any metal that's in there from machining can get into the oil passages, and then you'll pump that through your bearings and you'll be back at square one again. So they hot tank and clean everything, but usually they like taking the plugs out so they can clean down all those channels. They're kind of tricky to get out, and they're good at it. So there's some rust on the cam lobes, and I know that. And I knew I pressure washed this and let it sit for a while. So you can see there's some little rust staining here on these walls. It's not pitting, it's not bad, it's just some discoloration. But you don't know that until you take it apart. So I wanted to see, but that is specifically why I got the next size up pistons. So you can get the exact same size if your cylinder bores are perfect. But if there's any question about it, you can go to the next size up, which is usually 1/4 or 1/2 millimeter over, and then machine it to that, and you know for sure that it's nice. So I just got the engine and crank and pistons and rods and everything back from the machine shop. So we're gonna unload that. I'm gonna put some of it on the stand. There's a lot of cleaning I still have to do. Anytime you get anything back from the machine shop, you should really go through all the oil ports and clean everything. And then I'm gonna paint the block, and we're gonna go through the whole reassembly process with all the new fancy parts. it's time to start putting everything together. I had the block decked, bored for the new pistons. They checked my bearing clearances and blasted the block for me, which is great. So I went through, cleaned all the ports out. You always want to do that when you get something back from a machine shop, especially if it was blasted. It's just a nice peace of mind thing. Get some bore brushes, clean out as many passages as you can, use a bunch of brake clean, make sure it's nice. That I painted it up because I've never had a block this clean before. This is my opportunity. I like bright colors because they'll show me my oil leaks down the line. It'll be a little easier to spot. And for a race car, that's something I want to know about. I have 4 of the pistons in, and we're going to go over kind of what the deal is. We have these pistons and rods. The pistons are spec'd out by Integrated Engineering, so I'm going to a 9.5 to 1 compression ratio on this motor. And we have a set of their rods, which are way beefier than the stock stuff. The most important step when you're putting new pistons and rings and everything in a new engine is to gap your rings correctly. So I'm going to go through, and I did it on the other pistons. I'll show you the process now. This is my top ring. So I'm going to drop this in. I'll use the piston to square it up in the block. Now, my pistons came with a nice chart to show me, exactly for what bore size, there's a multiplier, and for what you're using the engine for, what your gap should be. So there's a little bit of math, but figured that out, and you just take some feeler gauges and go to make it fit, which this does not. So generally, out of the box rings will be a little tight so that you have some time, or you have some material to work with when you're grinding them to fit. Got this little piston ring grinder here. Set myself up. This is something you really want to take your time with. I'm doing it a little more aggressively because I've already done the other 4 and I have an idea of how much to take off. These chrome rings don't seem to leave a burr. You can usually feel it. If they do have a little burr, you want to file that off so it doesn't score the cylinder walls. There's nothing on these. Then just kind of keep repeating that process, dropping it in, making sure it's square, and then checking with your feeler gauges. As an engine is running, you're producing heat in here because there's an explosion happening. And as you're producing more power, there's more heat because it's a bigger explosion. So these rings expand with that heat, and they can't expand radially much because the block's there holding it, although that does expand slightly. It expands around the circumference. So you need a little gap there because if the rings touch together, they lock up, and that's how you break ring lands off of pistons and stuff, because it locks up in the bore, seizes, and then rips everything apart. So this gap is very important. We're just taking a feeler gauge, and when it slips in there nice, we know we've got it right. Now that all our rings are gapped, it's just a simple process of putting the rings on. I would start with the oil control ring, which is this lower one here, which you put in the wavy ring first. Then there's an upper and lower retainer. The upper. Then we'll do our second ring. Now you want to follow the instructions because every ring set's a little different. These have a little bevel on one side, and there's a little laser etching on it to show you which side is up. My second ring. And then we'll do that top ring. Now before you put it in, you don't want all your ring gaps lined up because that gives it a direct path for blow-by to go through. So before I put it in the engine, I'm going to make sure I stagger them all, either 180 degrees apart or on these other ones where there's 3 gaps, somewhere in between 90 and 180 apart. Just make sure they're not lined up is the key. Now we have to put our connecting rod on the piston. These have already been checked at the machine shop, so I know this is a good fit. I'm going to use some assembly lube on the bearing surfaces. The valve reliefs do matter, so these are for the intake valves. I know I put all of them with the machine shop marking this way, which is where the bearing tang is, and valve relief this direction. Slip in the pin, nice tight fit, and we have to get this little death clip to hold the wrist pin in, which can be infuriating. Nice. Now I need to lubricate the rings. Put some in the rings, worked into those channels. Now I'm going to check the gaps on the rings, make sure they're not aligned. Basically the simplest piston ring compressor there is, but if you take your time with it, they work just fine. The ring compressor is square and seated. Then just lightly bump it in the piston. It's in. So now we have to hook up or attach the rod bearing and cap. All right, now I gotta throw the bearing shell back in, make sure everything's nice and square. A bunch of assembly lube. And align my markings. I like to make sure the cap is fully seated by hand before trying to do anything with a tool. Then it's just as simple as torquing it to spec. That's it, that's the last rod in. So now we can start assembling the rest of the engine. Now that the bottom end's all together, we're gonna move over to the cylinder head. So I have new valve springs and retainers from Integrated Engineering. Those are all installed now. I did new valve stem seals while I was at it, lapped the valves in just to make sure the pattern was nice. The cams were damaged, as you saw, so it was a great opportunity to upgrade to these awesome cat cams. There's a 246 intake cam, 231 duration on the exhaust cam. This is their smaller turbo grind cam. It is a solid lifter conversion for this. So I've got new little roller rocker arms, we've got little solid lifters, and then a bunch of little shims for the solid lifters. We're gonna put the head on, time the motor, and check piston to valve clearance to make sure we're good to go. We also have to do that with advancing the cam phaser. So I'm not sure exactly if there will be piston to valve issues, and if there are, what they would be with the cam advanced. So I just took this apart to play with it and kind of wrap my head around its functionality. So that way I can cycle it and make sure we don't have any piston to valve clearance issues with the cam advanced. If we do, I might have to restrict travel or lock this out altogether. But first off, we have to check to know where we're gonna be. Not so smoothly. So these are the ARP head studs, which are quite a bit stronger, so you don't want to lift the head. For all these, it's very important that when you torque them, they're lubricated. This is the upper cam girdle without the sealant. All right, so when you're putting this many aftermarket parts together for an engine, it's really good to check everything. One of which that we're checking is the piston to valve clearance. I'm running aftermarket higher lift cams, I'm running aftermarket pistons, so there's a bunch of variables here. So to check piston to valve clearance, the simplest way without having a bunch of tools is a lot of people will clay the valves. I've heard and tried on this attempt to use aluminum foil because it compresses and then stays. I put a chunk of aluminum foil in that cylinder, put the head back on, timed it, cycled the engine with the cam phaser advanced. The piston was very close to touching the valves. So then I took it all back apart, checked my aluminum foil, put it all back together with the cam phaser locked out, and it's base setting without any advance, and there was tons of space. So then I had to kind of come up with a way to limit the cam phaser. So this is the cam phaser. The cam gear is bolted to this outer part here, and the intake cam itself is bolted to here. So the engine will feed oil pressure to one side or the other to adjust, this many degrees. To limit that, I talked with a couple other guys here, and the easiest thing for me to do is I came up with a little dowel pin. I drilled a little kind of boss in the bottom there and one in here, so the pin will stay located. Then if it advances, it'll be up against that pin, restricting travel. So that's now the fully advanced position versus this was before fully advanced. So now with it limited, the pin is stopping it. I put it back together again with my new limited cam phaser. Timed it all, had the phaser advanced, cycled the engine again with a new piece of aluminum foil, which is this one. And I have plenty of piston to valve clearance. So that pretty much wraps up the build of this engine. So we've gone through the whole thing. We did pistons, rods, bored everything over, did the cams, valve springs. So it's all assembled. Hopefully I never see the inside of this again. A couple little things to do, and I gotta get some cam plugs here. I forgot to order those. But next up, we're gonna bolt this up to the rest of the driveline, go over the clutch and flywheel, the adapter that came with the kit, and then throw it all back in the car and start putting everything else together for real. All right, so that brings us up to date on this. Make sure you follow along on the ECS YouTube channel, like and subscribe. You can follow the rest of my builds at Mike the Day on Instagram, and we'll see you next time.